What if protecting your family meant making a decision that could tear it apart? Margaret's choice to freeze her grandson's trust fund set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Family secrets, dangerous threats, and a fight for the future that no one was prepared for. Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth. Margaret Collins never thought that one decision would fracture her family. At 69, she had lived in the same little blue house for nearly 4 decades. The house, worn and weathered with time, held the echoes of laughter and quiet moments shared with Robert, her late husband. The walls had witnessed the growing years of their only son, Daniel, and now, they were filled with the sounds of her grandson Ethan's playful footsteps. This house was more than a home to Margaret. It was a symbol of her life, her legacy, and the love she had nurtured for those she held dear. But everything changed when Jessica came into their lives. Jessica was the type of woman who could easily capture attention, and at first Margaret had admired her confidence. She was beautiful, quick-witted, and seemed to love Daniel fiercely. For years she was a welcomed addition to their family. It wasn't until after their marriage that Margaret began to notice a subtle shift, little comments seemingly harmless at first, but they began to build a wall between Margaret and her son. "You call him too much," Jessica would say. "You act like he can't make his own decisions." At first, Margaret dismissed it, brushing off the tension as the natural distance that comes with adult children. But over time things began to change more rapidly. Daniel, her only child, grew more distant, his phone calls becoming fewer, his visits less frequent. And when he did come by, he seemed less present, distracted by Jessica's coldness toward Margaret. The once warm and open house now felt quieter, the space between Margaret and her son growing with every passing year. Then, one day, Jessica casually mentioned the trust fund. "We could really use some of that money now," she had said, sitting at the kitchen table as Ethan played on the floor with his toy dinosaurs. "It's for Ethan anyway, right? It's not like the money is doing anything just sitting there." Margaret's heart sank. It wasn't the first time she had heard such a suggestion, but this time the words struck a chord deep in her. That money, which she and Robert had worked so hard to protect, wasn't just a fund. It was a promise. A promise that Ethan would have security when he grew older, that he would have choices when he needed them most. That trust fund wasn't just about money. It was about his future. Margaret's thoughts raced, but she stayed calm, a trait she had learned over the years. "That money is for Ethan when he becomes an adult," she replied firmly. "It's not for anything else. That's what Robert and I agreed on." Jessica's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Plans change," she said flippantly, shrugging as if this was just another small obstacle. Margaret didn't press the issue then, but the conversation lingered in her mind. That night, she did what she never thought she would have to do. She called her lawyer, Mr. Hayes. She needed reassurance. Mr. Hayes was kind and patient, his voice steady as he explained, "Margaret, you are the trustee. The money cannot be moved without your approval. Everything is secure." But still, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her instincts told her to be cautious, and so she asked for additional protections. She wanted to be sure. She wanted to make certain that no one could touch that money without her knowing about it. The next few months passed in a blur of small arguments, subtle tensions, and more mentions of the trust fund. Jessica would bring it up again and again, sometimes softly, sometimes harshly. "We deserve more," she would say. "Daniel works so hard and we're stuck in this small house. Why wait for Ethan to be an adult? Why not give him some of that money now?" Margaret felt the pressure mounting, but she never relented. She knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about money. This was about protecting Ethan, about ensuring that his future wasn't gambled away in the name of someone else's ambitions. And then it happened. Daniel and Jessica showed up unannounced one morning, and everything that Margaret had been dreading finally came to a head. "We need to talk," Jessica said, her voice sharp as a knife. Margaret's heart raced, but she remained calm as she led them inside. Jessica didn't sit down, her posture stiff and commanding as she crossed her arms. "You need to stop interfering in our lives," she snapped. "You think you control everything because of that money. That ends today." Margaret stood tall, even as her world seemed to crumble around her. "I don't control you, Jessica," she said quietly. "I protect Ethan." Jessica's face contorted with anger. "You're holding us back. We want a better life, and you're acting like we don't deserve it. Margaret's voice remained steady. This isn't about your wants. This is about Ethan's future. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Margaret knew in that moment that her family was changing in a way she couldn't control. She was no longer just a mother and grandmother. She was now a protector, a guardian of the future. And though it tore her apart, she knew she had to make a decision that would protect Ethan at all costs. She made the call to Mr. Hayes that evening. "Freeze the trust," she said quietly, her voice resolute. "No one can move the money without my approval." Hey everyone, welcome to Empathetic Story. This is a story about a family, trust, and the choices we make when it feels like everything is falling apart. Stay with us to find out what happens next. And remember, if you want to hear more stories like this, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Margaret never thought it would come to this. But sometimes protecting the ones you love means standing firm, even when it feels impossible. If you've ever had to make a difficult decision for your family, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Empathetic Story for more powerful narratives that explore the bonds that shape our lives. Margaret had thought the worst was over after the confrontation with Jessica and Daniel, but it was only the beginning. The nagging sense of unease that had been building in her chest for months was now a heavy weight that she couldn't shake off. She knew Jessica's comments about the trust fund weren't just passing remarks. They were part of a deeper desire, one that threatened to unravel the delicate fabric of the family she had fought so hard to protect. As the days passed, Margaret couldn't ignore the growing distance between herself and her son. The conversations became shorter, more strained, and the warm connection she had once shared with Daniel seemed to wither in the shadow of Jessica's influence. Every time Margaret tried to speak to him, it felt like she was speaking to a stranger. His responses were mechanical, his eyes often avoiding hers, and it hurt in a way she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just about the trust fund anymore. It was about something deeper, something more fundamental. Margaret could feel the shift in Daniel, the way he was changing before her eyes. He had become more like Jessica, focused on status, success, and appearances. They both seemed to forget what really mattered: Ethan's future. And for Margaret, that was everything. She had spent years creating that trust fund with Robert, not for fancy homes or vacations, but for Ethan's security. They had built it carefully, methodically, with a vision for the future that didn't include the whims of an unpredictable world. It was supposed to be Ethan's safety net, something stable and untouchable. But now, Jessica's demands had shaken that foundation. Margaret could no longer trust the intentions of those she had once considered family. Jessica's attitude was all about now, about using what they had today no matter the cost. It was clear to Margaret that they didn't understand what the trust fund truly represented. It was in the middle of a quiet evening, as Margaret sat in the living room flipping through old photo albums, that her worries turned into action. She had always been the quiet one, the one who observed and analyzed, who chose to step back when others moved too quickly. But now, in this moment of clarity, Margaret knew she couldn't sit idle any longer. The phone call to Mr. Hayes had been the first step, but now the decision was in her hands. She could not allow Jessica or Daniel to see this as just a means to solve their immediate problems. They were running toward something that would leave them broken when the dust settled, and Margaret would not, allow her grandson's future to be one of those casualties. Margaret's next move was deliberate. She didn't want to believe it would come to this, but she knew what she had to do. The phone call to the bank was quiet, methodical, and perhaps in her heart, it felt like the most necessary thing she had ever done. She gave the bank instructions to freeze the trust, to lock it away so no one could access it without her approval. It was a decision she made out of love and fear. Love for Ethan, and fear of what might happen if she didn't act. But as soon as she made the call, she felt the weight of it. The family she had worked so hard to build, the connections, the love, they were all hanging by a thread. She knew the consequences would be severe. Jessica would be furious. Daniel would be confused. But Margaret, for the first time in a long while, felt sure. She was standing on solid ground, protecting what was right no matter the cost. The next morning, Margaret's phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was tight, strained, like someone who had been holding their breath too long. "Mom," he said, his tone cracking, "did you do something to the trust fund?" Margaret's heart ached as she heard the fear in his voice. But she had made her decision. She would not back down now. Yes, Daniel. I froze it, she replied, her voice calm despite the turmoil inside her. There was a long silence on the other end. Margaret could almost hear the thoughts racing through her son's mind. The confusion, the anger, the betrayal. He had never expected her to do this. To him it felt like a betrayal. But Margaret knew the truth. He didn't understand the real reason behind her actions. Why would you do that? He finally asked, the hurt in his voice evident. I did it for Ethan, Margaret said quietly. She couldn't say more, not yet. There were no words that could explain the depth of her decision, the love that had driven it, the fear that had made her act. She could feel the rift forming, widening between them. But for the first time it didn't matter. She had protected Ethan, and that was all that mattered. Daniel hung up, and the silence in Margaret's home became deafening. She sat there for a long time staring at the phone, wondering what the next step would be. But deep down, she knew that whatever happened next, she had done the right thing. She had fought for her grandson's future, and that was something she would never apologize for. As the days passed, the tension in the family grew. Jessica's anger was palpable. Daniel's confusion was heartbreaking. Margaret could feel the strain in every conversation, every glance exchanged. And yet, even as the storm raged around her, Margaret stood firm. She had made her decision, and now she had to face the consequences. She knew that standing her ground wasn't easy, but she had no other choice. The future was worth the cost. Margaret had hoped that by freezing the trust fund, she could protect Ethan's future and avoid a confrontation with her son and daughter-in-law, but the quiet relief she felt was short-lived. The moment she made the call, everything started to unravel, and what followed was nothing like what she had imagined. Daniel's confusion and Jessica's fury were just the beginning. The family she had spent her entire life building was now in a state of disarray, and every time Margaret tried to make sense of it, the tension between her and Daniel seemed to grow. Each phone call, each visit felt more strained than the last. She could sense the distance between them, like an invisible wall had risen up, and no matter how much she tried to reach through it, it was always there, cold and unyielding. Jessica wasted no time in making her feelings known. The first few days after the trust was frozen, she didn't even try to hide her anger. Every time they spoke, her voice was sharp, her words cutting through Margaret's attempts to keep the peace. She accused her of overstepping, of controlling their lives, and of refusing to see things from their perspective. Margaret, though, knew something Jessica didn't. This wasn't about control, it was about protection. One evening, a week after the phone call to the bank, Daniel came over alone. He looked exhausted, as though the weight of the situation had finally taken its toll. His hair was messy, his face tired, and when he spoke, his voice lacked the usual certainty Margaret had always associated with him. "Mom," he said after a long silence, "we need to talk." Margaret watched him as he stood in the doorway, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what to expect. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him in. They sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where they had shared countless meals and stories over the years. The same table where they had laughed together. As a family. But tonight it felt different. The air between them was heavy, as if every word that had been spoken over the past week was still lingering in the room. "Why did you do it?" Daniel finally asked. His eyes filled with a mix of hurt and frustration. "Why freeze the trust fund without telling me? We're family, Mom." Margaret felt her heart twist at the pain in his voice. She had never wanted to hurt him, but she had to stand firm. "I did it to protect Ethan," she replied quietly. "You don't understand, Daniel. The money was never meant to be used like this. It's not for today, or for any of your immediate needs. It's for his future, his security." Daniel's face reddened, and for a moment Margaret thought he might shout. But instead he looked away, his voice softening. "We're under pressure, Mom. You don't understand what this feels like. We're trying to do the right thing, but everything's falling apart." Margaret leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. She had known this wasn't just about money. The stakes were higher than she had initially realized. "What do you mean, Daniel?" she asked gently. He sighed, rubbing his forehead as though the words were difficult to come by. "The investment we made, it's not going well. We put everything into it. And now we owe money. We thought we could take some from the trust fund, fix things, and put it back before anyone noticed. But now it's bigger than we thought. Margaret sat in stunned silence. She had known something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the stomach. How much do you owe? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. $70,000, Daniel admitted, the weight of the words settling over him. We took out loans from private lenders, and now they're demanding their money back. We're out of options. Margaret's mind raced as she processed the information.
$70,000.
A large sum, but it wasn't the money that troubled her. It was the desperation in Daniel's voice, the fear in his eyes. This wasn't just a financial mistake. This was something much darker. Margaret realized with a sinking feeling that Jessica's insistence on accessing the trust fund was not about improving their lives. It was about covering up a much bigger problem. Who are these lenders? Margaret asked carefully, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. Daniel hesitated before answering. They're private, Mom. They're not exactly legal. The company we invested in. They promised us big returns, but now the whole thing's falling apart. The lenders are threatening us if we don't pay them soon. Margaret's blood ran cold. She had suspected that there was more to this than what Daniel had initially let on. You're in trouble with people who are threatening you? She asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Daniel nodded, his eyes cast downward. I didn't want to tell you this. But Jessica, she thought if we used the trust we could make everything go away. We thought we could fix it quietly. We never thought it would get this bad. Margaret sat back in her chair, the weight of everything crashing down on her. This was no longer just about protecting Ethan's money. This was about protecting her family from a mistake that was spiraling out of control. She had to act, but she didn't know how much further down this dangerous path they had already gone. Daniel, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady, you've put Ethan's future at risk, and you've put yourself in a dangerous position. You need to come clean. To me, and to the authorities. Daniel looked at her, his face pale. What do you mean? If you don't fix this, Daniel, it's not just the trust fund you're gambling with, Margaret said firmly. It's your life. And Jessica's. And Ethan's. The silence that followed felt heavy, thick with unspoken words. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Margaret knew it was too late to undo what had been done. But she also knew that the only way out was through the truth. For the first time in days, Margaret felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just protecting Ethan's trust fund anymore. She was protecting the future of the family she had built, the family she loved. And that meant making decisions no one else wanted to make. I'm not going to let you destroy Ethan's future, she said quietly. And I'm not going to let you destroy yourself in the process. Daniel finally nodded, tears filling his eyes. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know what else to do. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. We'll fix this, Daniel. Together. But as she sat there, holding her son's hand, she knew that this was just the beginning. And the road ahead would be harder than anything she had ever faced before. After that conversation with Daniel, Margaret could feel the weight of everything growing heavier with each passing day. The pieces of the puzzle had started to come together. But there was still one crucial thing left to understand. Just how deep the mess ran. The realization that Jessica and Daniel had invested in something dangerous and dishonest hit Margaret like a wave. She had thought that freezing the trust fund was enough to protect Ethan, but now it felt like that was only the tip of the iceberg. The web they had entangled themselves in was more complex than anything she had imagined, and the threat wasn't just financial. It was personal. It was real. The morning after their conversation, Margaret sat quietly at the kitchen table, her mind racing. She had spent years raising her son with the values of hard work and integrity, and now as she sipped her coffee, she wondered where it had all gone wrong. How had Daniel, her only child, ended up in a situation like this? She loved him, but there were times now more than ever when she didn't recognize the man he had become. Jessica's influence on him was evident, but it wasn't just that. There was something darker lurking beneath the surface. A desperation. A need to fix things at any cost. It wasn't long before Margaret's phone buzzed again. It was a text from Daniel, *, Mom, I need to talk. Please, can we meet? Margaret felt the familiar pang of worry in her chest. She had hoped that the conversation they'd had yesterday would have been a turning point, but she knew it wasn't that simple. Daniel was still lost in the mess they'd created, and now it seemed like the consequences were catching up to them faster than anyone could anticipate. She agreed to meet him at the local park, a quiet spot they used to visit when Daniel was younger. He'd always loved the swings, the way the chains creaked as they swayed in the breeze. Margaret thought it would be a good place to talk, away from the house, away from the tension that hung in the air there. When she arrived, Daniel was already sitting on a bench, his head down, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had settled on them. He didn't look up when Margaret approached, so she sat beside him in silence, waiting for him to speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel let out a shaky breath. "I've been thinking about everything you said," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the trust, about the money. And well, I don't know where to start." Margaret looked at him, her heart heavy with a mixture of love and sadness. "Start with the truth, Daniel," she said softly. "What have you really gotten yourself into?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his gaze drifting to the ground as if the answers were somehow written there. "It's all a mess," he admitted. "We invested in a property development company, but it was a scam. We didn't know. We thought it was a sure thing, but now it's falling apart. We're in debt. We owe so much, and I didn't know where else to turn." He paused, glancing at Margaret with tears in his eyes. "And now Jessica, she pushed me, Mom. She thought if we took the money from Ethan's trust we could cover it up. She thought it was the only way to fix things. We never meant for it to get this bad." Margaret's heart twisted with a combination of anger and deep concern. She could see how trapped Daniel felt, but she also saw the consequences of his actions clearly now. "You think taking Ethan's money was the solution?" she asked, her voice firm but not unkind. "You think that was the right thing to do?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I don't know what to think anymore. I wanted to fix it. I didn't want to disappoint Jessica, and I didn't want you to think I was failing." Margaret's eyes softened. "You're not failing, Daniel. But using Ethan's future as a way out, that's not the answer. You've already made things worse." For a moment they both sat there, the weight of their silence filling the space between them. Margaret wanted so badly to reach out and fix everything for him. She wanted to make him see that there was another way, a way out of this mess. But she knew the only way forward was for him to take responsibility, to face the consequences of his choices. She had to remind him of that. "I love you, Daniel," Margaret said gently, her voice breaking slightly. "But I'm not going to let you use Ethan's trust fund to fix this. The money isn't for you. It's not for Jessica. It's for Ethan. And I don't care how desperate things get. You have to face this, and so does Jessica." Daniel's face crumpled, and he nodded slowly. "I know, Mom. I didn't think it through. I thought we could make it right before anyone found out. But now I see how wrong we were." Margaret took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. "It's not too late to fix this, Daniel. But you need to come clean. To me, to the authorities, to everyone. You can't keep running from this." He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mom. I promise." Margaret smiled softly, a weight lifting slightly from her chest. "I'm here for you. But I need you to do the hard thing now. You have to make things right." And so they sat together in that park, under the same trees where Daniel had once played as a child. The air felt lighter, but Margaret knew that the hardest part of this journey was still ahead. She couldn't undo what had been done, but she could help her son find the strength to move forward, one difficult step at a time. As they got up to leave, Margaret glanced at Daniel one last time. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "But you need to face it. And so do I." Daniel nodded, his face serious now. He wasn't the same man he had been when he walked into that park, and Margaret knew in that moment that the road ahead would be long. But they would face it together no matter how hard it got. After their conversation at the park, Margaret felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, Daniel would find his way out of this mess. But as the days stretched into weeks, reality began to sink in. She knew that even with his promise to make things right, the truth would take time to come to the surface. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply entangled Daniel and Jessica had become in this web of lies, bad decisions, and deception. Margaret couldn't shake the images that had started to fill her mind. The risk Daniel and Jessica had taken. The secretive desperation that had driven them to betray the one thing that was supposed to keep Ethan safe. The trust fund, something so sacred to Margaret and Robert, had now become a pawn in their game of financial survival. She understood the desperation. She even understood the fear. But what she couldn't accept was the fact that they had put their son's future at risk. It was that night when things began to unravel in a way Margaret hadn't anticipated. She sat in the dimly lit living room, quietly staring at the framed photograph of Robert and herself, taken so many years ago, smiling in front of their house. The house that was now more than just a structure of walls and wood. It was a testament to the years of hard work, the late nights, the sacrifices. It was a symbol of love, of everything that had been built. Now she felt it all slipping away, one poor decision at a time. Her thoughts were interrupted by the shrill ring of her phone. It was Daniel. His voice came through the receiver, tight and tinged with anxiety. "Mom, I need to tell you something. Something bad." Margaret's stomach dropped. She could already sense where this was headed. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up inside her. "Mom," Daniel continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Jessica, she went to the bank again. She tried to withdraw a large sum of money. She said we could cover it up, get everything back in time. But they wouldn't let her. She's furious. She's scared." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She had hoped this would stay contained, that they would understand. But she knew deep down that there were no shortcuts in a situation like this. "I don't understand, Daniel," she said softly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "You told me you were going to handle this. What happened?" Daniel's silence spoke volumes, and when he finally spoke again, his words were slow, as if the weight of what he had to admit was crushing him. "I didn't know how deep we were in, Mom. I thought we could fix it before anyone noticed. But we've been lying to you. To ourselves. The money Jessica wanted from the trust? It's not for the house or the bills. It's to pay off some dangerous people. The ones we owe money to. The ones who won't let us walk away." Margaret felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. She had suspected they were in over their heads, but this was something else entirely. "You owe money to dangerous people?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Private lenders," Daniel answered, his voice small. "They promised us a quick fix, but it was a scam. And now we're stuck, Mom. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to drag you into this, but we can't keep running. Jessica's scared." "I'm scared." Margaret sat back in her chair, the weight of everything pressing down on her. This wasn't just about money or the trust fund anymore. It was about protecting her family from a situation that was spiraling out of control, a situation that they had unknowingly created. The fear in Daniel's voice broke her heart, but it also made her realize the importance of what she had done. Even if it hadn't been easy, she had stopped them from crossing a line they could never come back from. "You need to be honest with me, Daniel," Margaret said, her voice low but firm. "I know this is hard, but if you don't come clean about everything, we're all going to lose. Not just the trust fund, but your future, Jessica's future, Ethan's future. You have to tell me everything, and you have to fix this before it's too late." "I'm so sorry, Mom," Daniel said, the sincerity in his voice raw. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I could protect Jessica, protect all of us. But I see now that I've just made everything worse." Margaret's heart ached for him, for the boy she had raised, who was now a man lost in a world of bad decisions. But she also knew this was his chance to make things right, to come back from the brink before it was too late. She wasn't going to give up on him, no matter how far down the wrong path he had gone. "I know. You didn't mean for this to happen," Margaret said, trying to steady her breath. "But you have to stop running, Daniel. You have to face the consequences of your actions. I won't let you destroy Ethan's future. Not for anyone. Not for your mistakes." "I'll fix it, Mom," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I'll do whatever it takes." Margaret stood up and walked over to the window, looking out into the night. It was so quiet now, but the quiet was deceiving. Beneath the surface there was a storm brewing. She didn't know what the future held, or how much more her family would have to face before this was all over. But she knew one thing for sure. They couldn't hide from the truth anymore. No more lies. No more pretending. If they were going to survive this, they would have to come together, face the mess they had made, and start over. "I'm with you, Daniel," Margaret said, her voice filled with a calm strength that surprised even her. "But you need to do the right thing. You need to take responsibility." He nodded, his face serious now. "I will, Mom. I promise." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to calm the emotions swirling inside her. She had always known her love for Daniel was unconditional, but this was different. This was about breaking free from the darkness they had allowed into their lives. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt like she had some control over the situation. She had made a choice, a hard choice, and now it was time to see it through. This was just the beginning. But Margaret was ready. She had to be. For Daniel. For Jessica. And for Ethan. And whatever came next, they would face it together. Margaret had hoped that the worst was behind them. But as the days passed, the reality of the situation began to take a darker turn. Daniel's promise to make things right felt increasingly fragile, and the tension that had been simmering under the surface of their family life erupted in a way Margaret hadn't anticipated. The quiet weight of her decision to freeze the trust fund had shifted the family dynamics in ways she couldn't control. But what came next was something she hadn't expected: threats. It was a late evening when the first threat arrived. Margaret was sitting in her favorite chair, the one by the window where she'd always read her books or watched the world outside. The room was still, and for a moment, it felt like everything was finally settling down. But then the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone, and when she opened the door, she saw a man standing on her porch. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face hidden in shadow. He held an envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Collins?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," Margaret replied, her heart pounding in her chest. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "This is for you," the man said, extending the envelope toward her. "A message. It's important." Margaret's hand hesitated before she took the envelope. She didn't know why, but the air around her felt heavier, charged with an unease she couldn't shake. She stared at the man as he turned and walked away without saying another word. Her hands trembled as she closed the door behind her and turned the envelope over. No return address. No name. Just her own name neatly written on the front. She opened it slowly, the words inside feeling colder than the night air outside. "Release the funds or things will get messy." The message was simple, direct, and laced with a threat she could feel in her bones. Margaret stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. She had known this would be hard. She had known that freezing the trust fund would cause ripples, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the money anymore. Someone new, someone outside of the family, and they were sending a clear message that they wouldn't back down. Her mind raced. She knew she had to act, but the fear for her family, for Daniel, for Ethan, crept into her heart. What had they gotten themselves into? The desperation they had tried to cover up, the lies, the risk they had taken. It had all come to this. The phone rang, snapping her back to the present. She didn't have to check the caller ID to know it was Daniel. His voice came through, strained and full of anxiety. "Mom," he said quickly, "you won't believe this. The lenders. They know about the trust fund. They sent someone to your house, didn't they?" Margaret swallowed hard. She wasn't sure how to answer him. She wasn't sure if she could keep her voice steady. "Yes," she whispered. "They did. They left me a message. They're threatening me, Daniel. They want the money, and they're not going to stop." "I should have known," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "We didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think it would get to this point, Mom. But they're dangerous. And now they know we're desperate." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of it all pressing down on her. This wasn't just about saving face anymore. This was about survival, her family's survival. The situation had escalated beyond anything she had imagined. The people Daniel and Jessica had gotten involved with weren't just shady investors. They were dangerous, and they weren't going to let go of their claim easily. She couldn't let herself break. She couldn't let her son see how deeply this hurt her, how afraid she was. But the truth was she was scared. Scared for Daniel, scared for Ethan, and scared of what might happen if she didn't stand her ground. "We have to tell the police, Daniel," Margaret said, her voice strong despite the fear creeping into her chest. "We can't keep running from this. If they're going to threaten us, we need to make sure everything is out in the open." "No," Daniel replied quickly. "They'll make it worse. They've been watching us, Mom. They know everything. They know about the trust. They're just waiting for us to make the wrong move." Margaret could hear the panic in his voice, and for a moment she was tempted to back down. But then she remembered Ethan, her grandson, the child she had promised to protect. She couldn't let him grow up with this kind of fear, this kind of uncertainty hanging over him. "I've already made my move, Daniel," Margaret said firmly.
I've protected Ethan.
"I froze the trust to keep him safe, and I'm not going to let anyone threaten him. We can't just let this go on." Daniel was silent for a long time before he spoke again. "I don't know what to do, Mom. I don't know how to fix this, but I'll do whatever it takes. I swear it." Margaret closed her eyes, relief washing over her. It wasn't enough. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. She knew that this battle wasn't over, and that it was only going to get worse before it got better. But she also knew that as long as they fought together there was still hope. "I'm not doing this alone, Daniel," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "And neither are you. We're going to get through this together." The line went quiet for a moment, and Margaret could almost hear the weight lifting from her son's shoulders, just a little. And for the first time in a long while Margaret believed it too. Whatever came next, whatever threats were waiting for them in the dark, they would face it as a family. And that, in itself, was enough to keep going. After Daniel's heartfelt promise to face the consequences, Margaret could feel a strange sense of resolve settling in her chest. The weight of the situation hadn't lightened, but there was something undeniably different now. They were no longer hiding, no longer pretending. They were going to deal with this head-on no matter how painful or messy it would get. And Margaret knew that, as hard as it was, this was the only way forward. The following days were a blur of calls with lawyers, police officers, and financial advisors. Margaret had never imagined her life would involve so much bureaucracy and legal speak, but this was where they found themselves. The investigation into the fraudulent property company was already underway, and the police were taking her threats seriously. They had asked her to keep a low profile for now, which wasn't easy, especially when every corner of her life seemed to be filled with tension and uncertainty. Daniel and Jessica were more cooperative than she had expected. After that difficult conversation at the park, Daniel had stopped avoiding the truth. He had turned over every document he could find. Emails, contracts, even texts with the shady lenders. It wasn't enough to erase the damage they'd done, but it was a start. Jessica, though still on edge, seemed to understand the magnitude of their situation. She was no longer the angry woman who demanded access to the trust fund. She had softened, at least for now, knowing that the alternative was far worse. It was the morning after one of these intense sessions with the police that Margaret received another unexpected call. This time it wasn't Daniel or a lawyer. It was a detective, someone who had been involved in the investigation into the lenders. Detective Ramirez. Margaret had spoken to him before, but this time his tone was different. It was more urgent. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice steady but serious, "I need you to be prepared for what's coming next. We've uncovered some additional information that could make things a lot more complicated for your son and daughter-in-law. We're going to need you to be involved." Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had known that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. But hearing those words, complicated and involved, made her heart sink. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of concern she couldn't hide. "Your son and his wife aren't just tangled up with a fraudulent company," Detective Ramirez explained. "They've also been in contact with some individuals tied to illegal activities. Lenders who are known for using threats and intimidation to get their money. The situation is bigger than just the bad investment." Margaret's thoughts raced as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about their safety, their freedom. And worse yet, it was about Ethan, her precious grandson. The people involved in this weren't just financial criminals. They were dangerous, and Margaret couldn't help but wonder what kind of mess they had dragged her family into. "Are they safe?" Margaret asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. "We're working on it," the detective replied. "But your son and daughter-in-law need to understand the risks they're taking. They're in over their heads. The best thing you can do right now is to continue cooperating with the investigation. If they want to stay out of serious trouble, they'll need to come clean about everything." Margaret closed her eyes, her mind swirling with the information she had just learned. She had hoped that by calling the police, by freezing the trust, they could protect Ethan from the fallout of their decisions. But now the stakes were even higher than before. She wasn't just protecting her grandson's future anymore. She was protecting her son and his family from forces they had underestimated. When Daniel came over that afternoon, looking more exhausted than ever, Margaret didn't waste any time. She had to tell him everything. She had to make him understand that they couldn't escape what was coming. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I've spoken to the police again. Things are more serious than I thought. They've found out that the people you've been dealing with aren't just criminals, they're dangerous. I need you to understand that." Daniel's face paled, his eyes wide with shock. "What do you mean, Mom? What are you saying?" "These lenders, these people you borrowed from, they're connected to a whole network of illegal activity. The police are investigating them, and they've uncovered things that go beyond just bad investments. This is bigger than you thought." Daniel sank into the chair across from her, his face a mixture of disbelief and fear. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know it would go this far. I just thought if we could fix it, everything would go back to normal." Margaret reached out and placed a hand on his. "It's not about fixing it anymore, Daniel. It's about facing what you've done, and facing what's coming. You need to take responsibility for everything, and you need to stop hiding. The truth is the only way out of this." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything, the lies, the mistakes, the consequences, hung heavily in the air between them. Margaret wanted to scream, to let her son know how much she had hoped he would make the right choices, how much she had believed in him. But she couldn't. The truth was, they were all in this together now. And that meant no more secrets, no more running. "I'm sorry, Mom," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to fix it. I didn't think it would go this far." Margaret nodded slowly. "I know you didn't. But now you have to face it. You can't fix what's already been done, but you can make things right from here on out. The only way forward is the truth. And you have to make sure that Ethan's future is safe. Do you understand?" Daniel wiped his eyes and nodded. "Yeah, I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Margaret let out a long, slow breath, her heart still heavy but somehow a little lighter. She had no illusions that things would get easier from here. The road ahead was still dark and uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like they were finally on the right path. The future was still uncertain, but they were going to face it head-on, together. In the end, Margaret's decision to freeze the trust fund wasn't just about protecting money. It was about standing firm in her values and protecting what mattered most, her family's future. Her actions may have seemed harsh at first, but they came from a place of deep love and a commitment to doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most difficult choices are the ones that shape our lives for the better. Margaret's unwavering determination to protect her grandson's future and her family's integrity in the face of adversity is a lesson we can all learn from. Life doesn't always present us with easy answers, and sometimes the things we love most are the very things that are hardest to protect. But if we are honest with ourselves, if we stand by our principles, and if we face challenges head-on instead of avoiding them, we can navigate the toughest situations with strength and clarity. The story teaches us that love, responsibility, and integrity are the pillars upon which we must build our relationships, and that protecting what matters, whether it's family, values, or the future, is worth the sacrifices we make. The lesson here is that we must never compromise on what truly matters, even when faced with pressure, deceit, or difficult choices. We must stand firm, trust our instincts, and protect the things we value most, even when it seems like the world is against us. In our own lives, it's essential to remember that it's okay to say no to things that threaten our integrity or our loved one's future. What would you do in a situation like this? How far would you go to protect your family's future? Leave a comment below with your thoughts and join the conversation. Your perspective could help others who are facing difficult decisions. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Empathetic Story so we can continue sharing meaningful stories with you. Your support means the world to us.